What if I told you that predicting the future isn't some kind of magic, that it's not a rare gift, but a skill? Yeah, a skill you can practice, you can measure, and you can actually get better at. Okay, let's dive into this because we are about to pull back the curtain on the art and the science of seeing what's coming next.
But, our story really has to start with a pretty shocking discovery. After one of the biggest studies of expert judgment ever, a researcher named Philip Tetlock came to this conclusion. I'll say it again, a dart-throwing chimpanzee. That's how well the experts we see on TV, the ones we read in the news, that's how well they were doing at predicting huge world events. So that begs a pretty important question, right? If the very people we trust to have all the answers are doing no better than random chance, is it even possible to predict things accurately? Or is everyone just guessing? Well, that question kicked off a 2-decade-long investigation, a real hunt for the truth.
Let's start with what we can call the expert problem. Okay, picture it, the 1980s. The Cold War is in full swing. All the experts, both liberal and conservative, were totally confident that the next Soviet leader would be another hardliner. They just argued about why. And then, boom, history took a sharp turn, and pretty much all the intellectuals fell right off the train. Mikhail Gorbachev showed up. The world changed forever, and it caught almost everyone completely by surprise.
It was this massive, widespread failure of the so-called experts that really kicked off the search for an answer. I mean, if most of them are failing, were there any who were actually getting it right? This led to a huge research project, the Good Judgment Project, to find out. It was literally a hunt for those rare people who could consistently beat the odds.
And the scale of this hunt was just immense. Over 20 years, the project gathered about 28,000 predictions from thousands of people on basically everything, from politics at home to huge international crises. This was no quick poll. It was a serious, long-term scientific investigation.
Just think about that timeline for a minute. This whole thing started when the Soviet Union was still a global superpower, and it finished long after the USSR was just something you read about in history books. This was a long, patient search for the truth, not some quick attempt to grab a headline.
So after 20 years and 28,000 predictions, what did they find? What was the big reveal? Well, the best forecasters, the ones who consistently beat not only that dart-throwing chimp, but also, get this, intelligence analysts with access to classified info, they weren't the people you'd expect at all. They were just ordinary people.
Let me put a face on this for you. Meet Bill Flack. He's not some talking head on a 24-hour news channel. He's a retired guy from the Department of Agriculture. He lives in Nebraska. He loves birdwatching. And he is one of the best forecasters of global events they ever found. So how on earth does a guy like Bill Flack do it?
Well, the first clue comes from a tiny scrap of Greek poetry that's about 2,500 years old, brought back to life by the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And it gives us this incredible metaphor for two totally different ways of thinking, the fox versus the hedgehog.
And the difference between these two is just night and day. See, the hedgehog looks at the world through the lens of one single big idea. They're super confident, very decisive, and they make for fantastic television. The fox, on the other hand, is a lot more cautious. They know a bunch of little things, and they stitch ideas together from all over the place. They're okay with nuance, with complexity, and while that might be kind of boring on TV, it turns out to be amazing for forecasting. The foxes consistently, and I mean by a lot, beat the hedgehogs.
Okay, so we know superforecasters think like foxes, but what does that actually look like in practice? Let's open up their mental toolkit and see the specific habits of thought that let people like Bill Flack see the future just a little bit more clearly than the rest of us. The first tool is a really cool technique called Fermi-izing, named after the physicist Enrico Fermi. He famously asked his students to estimate the number of piano tuners in Chicago. I mean, that sounds impossible, right? But wait, you can break it down. How many people live in Chicago? How many pianos might there be per person? How often do they get tuned? How long does a tuning take? All of a sudden, this giant unknown becomes a series of smaller, much more reasonable guesses. This is a core superforecasting skill.
Next up is something that's really hard for us humans, resisting a good story. Let's say I ask you if the Renzetti family owns a pet. Most of us, we start with the inside view. We start picturing the family, making up a story. But a superforecaster, they start with the outside view. They ask a different question. What percentage of American households own a pet? That statistical number, that base rate, is a way better starting point than our own, probably biased, little story.
And that leads perfectly into the third tool, what they call the dragonfly eye view.
You know how a dragonfly's eye is made up of thousands of tiny lenses, each one seeing the world from a slightly different angle? Superforecasters do that with ideas. They go out of their way to find different perspectives, especially views that challenge their own. They'll even ask themselves, would I find this argument convincing if it was coming from someone else? It's just a killer way to fight our natural tendency to only look for evidence that proves us right.
So, is that it? Is superforecasting just a set of tricks you can memorize? Well, not quite. The final verdict from this whole investigation is that it's less about a specific toolkit and more about a fundamental mindset, the mindset of always being in perpetual beta. This idea actually comes from the work of psychologist Carol Dweck. Superforecasters have what she calls a growth mindset. They don't think their intelligence or their abilities are set in stone. No, they believe that with effort, they can get better. And here's the key. Because they believe they can improve, they actually put in the work to do it.
So this, right here, is the engine of their improvement. It's a constant feedback loop. You make a forecast, you see what happens, you analyze why you were right or wrong, and you have to be brutally honest about it. Then you adjust your thinking, and then you try again. See, it's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to learn from your imperfections.
This famous line, often credited to the economist John Maynard Keynes, just perfectly captures the spirit of a superforecaster. It's the ultimate expression of intellectual humility. Your beliefs aren't these precious treasures you have to protect at all costs. They're just hypotheses to be tested against reality. And when the evidence changes, a superforecaster isn't just willing to update their beliefs, they're eager to. And that kind of brings this whole lesson back to us, doesn't it? Superforecasting isn't really just about predicting the next global crisis. It's a way of thinking more clearly about our own lives, our own decisions. So as we wrap this up, I'll just leave you with this question to think about. Based on the evidence you have right now, what's one belief you're willing to update today?